So in 1970, this new sound just erupts onto the scene, and it creates this massive crack in the history of music. It was heavy, it was dark, and it wasn't born in some sunny California studio. Nope, it came from the industrial heart of England. Okay, let's get into how the band Black Sabbath didn't just write some new songs, they accidentally hammered out an entire genre.
But here's the thing, when their first album dropped, the critics, they absolutely hated it. The legendary Lester Bangs from Rolling Stone just dismissed them, calling their music discordant jams made by, well, unskilled laborers. They were seen as crude, way too simple, and just completely out of touch.
And yet, the fans felt very differently. I mean, despite the critics trashing it, that album shot straight to number 8 on the UK charts. And what's so wild about that is the huge disconnect it showed, right? The cultural gatekeepers heard nothing but noise, but a whole new generation of fans, they heard their own lives, their own reality blasting back at them.
So how in the world did that happen? Well, the answer isn't some simple story about artistic genius. It's actually a story about where they lived, the pressures they were under, and one pivotal, absolutely life-changing accident.
All right, so first, let's kind of set the stage. We need to understand the musical world that Black Sabbath was about to just completely shatter. You gotta remember, the late 1960s were all about the flower power movement. The radio was just filled with peace, love, psychedelic vibes. But over in Birmingham, England, something else was cooking. A sound that was the total opposite. Heavy, threatening, and born from a much, much tougher reality. And that tough reality is really the first piece of the puzzle to understanding their sound. It all starts with the city that created them. So the band grew up in a part of Birmingham called Aston, nicknamed the City of 1,000 Trades. Think about it. Factories were right next to their houses. So the constant pounding rhythm of heavy machinery wasn't just background noise. It was the subconscious soundtrack of their entire lives. The future for kids like them looked pretty bleak. In fact, their own teachers would call them factory fodder. The whole idea was that school was just a conveyor belt leading straight to a life of hard manual labor in the factories. There wasn't a lot of encouragement, just a path that was already laid out for them. And I mean, this just perfectly illustrates that path. Just look at their first jobs. Ozzy worked in a slaughterhouse. Tony was operating a giant metal press. Geezer and Bill were also on track for that same kind of life. For these guys, music wasn't just a hobby. It was pretty much the only escape route they could imagine. And this quote just sums it all up. They weren't chasing fame and fortune like we think of it today. They were desperately running away from a future of total drudgery, where the grand prize for giving your entire life to a factory was a cheap clock. But that desperation was about to run headfirst into a tragic accident that would change everything. This right here, this is the catalyst, the one single moment that, out of pure necessity, would force an innovation that changed rock music forever. So on his very last day of work at a sheet metal factory, a 17-year-old Tony Iommi had this horrific accident. A guillotine press came down and sliced off the tips of the middle and ring fingers on his right hand, which, for a left-handed guitarist, was his fretting hand. Doctors told him, flat out, "Your dream of being a musician is over." But Tony refused to quit. He actually engineered his own solutions. It's incredible. First, he melted a plastic soap bottle and shaped it into little prosthetic thimbles for his fingertips. Second, because he couldn't feel the strings anymore, he switched to super light banjo strings. And third, to make those easier to press down, he started tuning his whole guitar lower to loosen the tension. And here is the absolute key to this whole story. Those physical adaptations, born from a horrible injury, directly created the musical blueprint for what we now call heavy metal. Now, the band was already messing around with darker sounds. Geezer Butler, the bassist, was inspired by classical music and pushed Tony to explore these really dissonant sounds. They landed on something called the tritone, an interval that sounds so unsettling that back in medieval times, they used to call it the devil in music. Yeah, that became their signature. So now look at how this all connects. Tony's downtuning, that created that massive, heavy, sludgy guitar sound. The light strings, they allowed him to do his signature wobbly vibrato. And because his homemade fingertips made playing fast, complicated solos almost impossible, he was forced to rely on huge, powerful, simple chords, the very power chords that define heavy metal riffs to this day. And their lyrics, which were mostly written by Geezer Butler,
totally mirrored this dark sound. While all their contemporaries were singing about peace and love, Sabbath was writing about the real terrors they saw around them, the trauma of war, social chaos, and the grim reality of living in an industrial wasteland.
So what happens when you mix the sound of a factory, the innovation born from an accident, and lyrics that tell the truth about a grim reality? You don't just get a band, you get a legacy.
I mean, their impact is just staggering. They didn't just play heavy music. They basically wrote the rulebook for the entire genre's sound, look, and themes. They directly inspired countless other genres, from doom metal all the way to grunge. Their second album, Paranoid, has sold almost 10 million copies. They literally took the hardship of their youth and turned it into a worldwide art form. Their journey was just unbelievable. I mean, they went from a rehearsal room in a bleak factory town in '69 to completely redefining music in 1970, all the way to playing their final, emotional show almost 50 years later. That journey really cemented their story as a legend, marking the end of an era. And that really leaves us with one final thought. Black Sabbath's story is this powerful reminder of how incredible art can be forged in the fire of hardship and limitation. It really makes you wonder, what new, world-changing sounds are being created right now, not by choice, but because of the unique pressures and accidents of our modern world?